Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of 3 shows we're doing today. And it's been 5 years since Linda Hervieux appeared on World War II TV and 10 years since her fab book, Forgotten, there's my copy there, was released. So it's a timely opportunity to, as we are on the 81st anniversary of D-Day, to bring her back for a conversation about Waverly Woodson, the update on his situation with regards recognition and medals, where we are in terms of African Americans in Normandy and their appreciation, their understanding, recognition, etc., etc., etc. I'll bring her in now. She's just up the road from me in Paris, so here we are. So good afternoon, Linda. How are you today?
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on again.
Good. I'm glad to have you back. So I was just sort of talking before going live there. There's these sort of in the historiography of where we're going, and that we didn't talk about certain aspects of war, then we do talk about it, and then it becomes unfashionable or woke or fashionable again. But before we get into that kind of heavier conversation about making sure we represent everybody who served in World War II, since you did the book, it was one of those projects that just it carried on because there was this ongoing campaign, if you like, to get him and the other men rare recognition. So give us the update on what the 10 years have seen.
Well, we had a big victory last year. So last September, since the book came out, there's been a campaign to get Waverly Woodson the Medal of Honor. And what we learned was that he had been nominated for the Medal of Honor. He didn't receive it because no Black soldiers did during World War II. And then last fall, after a campaign that was really aided by an Army historian who devoted 2 years of his time to follow the trail in my book to try to get more evidence to have a bulletproof case that Waverly Woodson should get the medal. He got the Distinguished Service Cross. So that's number 2, and usually a stepping stone to the Medal of Honor. And so that was a ceremony in Washington on Capitol Hill with Joanne Woodson, 94 years old, Waverly Woodson's widow. And it was just really fantastic.
I mean, and that's thanks to the work of yourself and these historians, and it has been used as like a kind of a benchmark case, isn't it? Because it's the if you can get recognition for one, you're in a sense getting recognition for all. But for those who don't know his story, we should recover that because it is an extraordinary story, and there are thousands of extraordinary stories from June the 6th, 81 years ago, but Woodson's is exceptionally extraordinary. So it's been a while. There's a new audience of World War II TV fans. So remind us what he did.
So Waverly Woodson landed early on June 6, 1944 on Omaha Beach. He was a medic with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, which is the subject of my book, Forgotten. You can see this is the US cover you're seeing on the slide. You have the UK cover. Yep. And so the backstory is, in World War II, the Black units were segregated, so by race. So that meant that they had top commanders who were white. So Waverly Woodson trained as an officer. There were very few quoted slots allowed for African Americans as officers, and he retrained as a medic. He was a pre-med student at college in the U.S., and he, even before he got his boots on the sand on Omaha Beach, he was wounded twice in the approach, seriously wounded, shell that ripped open his inner thigh and buttocks. He was patched up. He came ashore 9:30 in the morning, and when he did, he was following a tank that got a direct hit. And he was with several other medics, 4 other medics, and he set up basically a tent roll on the side of the beach, and that was where he did triage, saved countless men, dozens, if not even more. And he worked for 30 hours in, being seriously wounded himself. On the morning of June 7th, he rescued a line of British Tommies who were coming into Omaha Beach. And after that, he collapsed, and he was taken to a medical ship and he couldn't wait to get back on the beach. So he was very much a hero on D-Day, and he was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross by his unit commander. That recommendation was up to Medal of Honor by higher commanders who heard about what he did. He would get a Bronze Star, which a lot of other men got for bravery, but it's not the Medal of Honor. And so that became a campaign to get him the Medal of Honor.
And I remember talking last time that the slightly complicated nature is that, and I'm going to be a bit the geeky kind of overview historian, is that the Fifth Corps, overseeing the landings in Omaha, just decided fairly last minute they wanted to have more medics in those first and second wave landing craft. So they basically just borrowed them, for want of a better word, from units like the 320th and other units as part of the Engineer Brigade. And these solo men from another unit then got put inside these other landing craft, and it meant that their story was sort of unofficial, official, wasn't it? It got a bit complicated as to what their status was, and it happened with other units and stories I'm aware of. So he sort of fell through the cracks at the time. But the other thing I think is worth mentioning is that at the same time as he fell through some cracks, some of the other African Americans he was friends with, they made the African American press, didn't they? They were big heroes within their communities, but maybe not a wider audience. So can I explain a bit, because your book goes into great detail about how segregation actually affected the men in the service and how it affected people pre-war, and it's a bit complicated, isn't it? But how did it work in terms of just the difficulties of as I say, the news channels, black channels followed the black men, and the white kind of news outlets followed the white men. Explain how that worked.
Well, to put it simply, I mean, Waverly Woodson was a star after D-Day in the black press, but he was also widely reported in the white press too, including Stars and Stripes, the Army newspaper, for his heroism. He was interviewed by white newspapermen. There was not a huge effort in general by the white press to cover the deeds of African Americans. In fact, probably through huge swaths of the U.S. and segregated Jim Crow America, they wouldn't report on the efforts of the black soldiers at all. I mean, the black soldiers were treated terribly on their return to the U.S. in their uniforms, just as they were after World War I, just as they were whenever they were wearing uniforms showing a proud display of patriotism. And that never went well with Southern whites. And so in the case of Waverly Woodson, what was interesting is while he was well known, and the black press was a formidable press, they had huge circulations and they were quite well endowed in terms of resources. And they had correspondents in Europe who interviewed the African-American soldiers on the beach, who followed the black GIs as they were known in Britain. And they were a huge hit across Britain. And their story was really, and my book is really about their journey through segregated America to freedom in Britain and France. And the war is the backdrop of my book, of course, but D-Day's the very end. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, feel free to share more of your photos and we'll just carry on this conversation. But, Woodson's story is just, it stands out as being exceptional. I mean, I'm privileged enough. Charles Shea, the Native American veteran, lives in Normandy. He's been unwell the last couple of years, but his deeds are recognized now with the Native American monuments. There's a Charles Shea monument. So we are widening the story now. It's not seen quite as separated as it was back in World War II. But the other thing about Woodson's story is that he's not necessarily your typical African American. You said earlier that pre-med, things like that. The situation is that there was a lot of menial jobs they were required to do in the army. The barrage balloon thing wasn't so much. I mean, there was a lot of technology behind it as well, but it was still a physical job, wasn't it? That is what the deal was. They were given those jobs that required physical exertion, isn't it?
Well, the black troops were largely consigned to labor and service units. A lot of their combat roles that they had enjoyed in earlier wars were gradually taken away through the years from the American Civil War up through World War I and World War II. But this was a specialty unit. This was a barrage balloon unit, one of 30 that were developed, and the only one to be deployed in Normandy. This was not a labor battalion. This was very much a specialist battalion, and all of the men were very proud to be in it. And their commander, their white commander, Corporal Leon Reed, was also very proud to be there, to be leading them. And that was also rare, because a lot of the commanders of black units in World War II were not proud of that, and they let their men know that. And so that contributed to huge morale problems within those units. In the case of the 320th, they knew that they were special. They knew that they were doing something important. They trained at a specialty camp built just for them in Tennessee. They, in the case of Waverly Woodson and the medics, Waverly Woodson should have been an officer right off. And so he, though, was happy to train as a medic because he wanted to save people. And so he very quickly, he also signed up. He did not wait to be drafted like a lot of the enlisted men. He wanted to serve, and he wanted to serve as soon as he could.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we learned from the recent Netflix 6888 film about the African American Postal Battalion, and Kevin Hemel, who wrote the article that film was based on, came on and talked about that. And you absolutely sense from that generation of people of color, they wanted to serve, they wanted to do whatever they could for the country, and they just had to accept that they couldn't necessarily be in the role they wanted. Perhaps they couldn't want to be a ranger, or they wanted to be a paratrooper, they wanted to be this, but they would have to just do whatever it was the army would let them do. And then, as you say, they try and excel within the limited field they're allowed to incorporate. And Gregory Fontenot is in the sidebar today. Colonel Fontenot wrote a fantastic book about the 1st Division, and as soon as you started talking, he said about the importance of the story there. In fact, he said, "Great story. Very few folks know about the Barrage balloon units, and they're all on D-Day." And that's the thing. We tend to follow those frontline combat infantry units in the 1st Division, and forget that there was this incredibly important, vital support network behind it, of which the barrage balloons are one, protecting that beachhead, keeping German aircraft away from the established foothold in France. But the barrage balloons didn't kind of get them. They didn't get the movies. They didn't get because it seems to the uninitiated a sort of a not a pointless task, but it doesn't have the immediacy of an infantry company.
Well, remember, these men were infantry soldiers.
Of course,
They landed in many 150 landing crafts with the infantry, with the 1st Division, with the 4th Division. And when they hit the beach, their job was always going to be to stay on the beach. They were not going up and over bluffs and continuing on. Their job was to stay there. But for the first hours of
they have to fight for their right to stay there. Yeah,
they did, and they rounded up prisoners. They did everything that the infantry soldiers did. And the only difference is they were then digging trenches and staying put. They were up and, ridding the pillboxes overlooking Omaha of the enemy soldiers. And then they were going back down and staying on that beach. And they would stay on that beach until October. And units would go along the coast to Cherbourg, freeing, to the other areas as they were liberated, but there was a core that was staying on Omaha and Utah beaches for the duration.
And the barrage balloon is one of those things that, if you're not really consciously looking at photos, thinking about, are there barrage balloons there in the background, you sometimes kind of miss them. And then when you kind of go into it with a mindset of I will try and actually notice how many photos have balloons in it, and you realize a huge number of just generic photos just have balloons in the background. But we have it's almost like white noise. We just see the detail in the foreground, and we don't sort of notice that there's always these balloon presence in the back there. There they are. They're protecting our launch. They're protecting the beaches. Yeah, see, that's not the first thing your eye is drawn to in that photo. Your eye is drawn to the lines of LSTs, and then the vehicles going up in column off the beach there. And then only, I feel, like kind of your second observation, you notice the balloons in the back there. And unless we're having this type of discussion today, Linda, where balloons are front and foremost, and then of course you go, oh yeah, there they are again, and it was, and they were just there. They did their job.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, but so no soldiers of color are depicted storming the beach on D-Day, even though there were many who did from this battalion, and then later in the day there would be up to 2,000 African Americans. Most of them unloading ships and under punishing fire, and just racing to get those supplies off before all of that small arms fire was taken care of. And I think that that's interesting. Also, we talked before about how Saving Private Ryan has no depictions of Black soldiers in it. However, you see the balloons. And I'll show you, the cover of the book. This is the American cover is Robert Capa, and you can see these balloons over Omaha Beach. And so what's interesting about those balloons is, at the time, the Allies did not know how diminished the Luftwaffe was. And the sooner they could get these balloons up protecting the beaches, the better. And they did get balloons up on June 6th, the overnight from June 6th to June 7th. And by that time, the German Air Force was aware of this surprise attack and rallied and got planes in the air. And these men would play these balloons, flown from the ground. Also, let's be clear, a lot of people, I talk about this, and when I forget to say flown from the ground, they think that they're piloted craft. Remember, these balloons, how they worked, they had a steel cable and they had a bomb tucked underneath them. And this was a British design that the Americans developed from the British, and copied them exactly. Those little bomblets were about the size of a Coke can, some of the men said to me. And, a good hit could explode the wing or a gas tank. And their job was to keep the beaches safe, to protect the men, the materiel, the shipping coming in. And so they were effective doing that.
I went to attended a lecture by Russell Hart, the American professor of history down in Hawaii. That was in San Diego a couple of years ago. And he did a presentation about the Luftwaffe in Normandy and the fact that there was some presence. It wasn't big. The Allies had air superiority, but they didn't have air supremacy. And he talked. I remember him distinctly saying that the Luftwaffe learned very quickly to not head for the places that had the balloons, because they were too dangerous. So they did attack Allied positions, but they didn't attack the ones protected by the balloons. So you get this sort of converse situation where people say, well, the balloons didn't bring any aircraft down. Well, no, because the Germans learned not to go there. They went
they did.
They work at their best as a deterrent, don't they?
They're credited with a few hits. The problem,
they had a few,
the problem is, well, it's hard to confirm, because the balloons were alongside the anti-aircraft artillery guns. And so they worked as a team. And so planes that were taken out, the Germans rushed 300 planes to Normandy. So they had planes in the air. It wasn't the 1,300, I believe, that the Allies expected, but it was significant. And those beaches where they were unloading those ships, they were unloading those tanks, they were unloading those trucks, everything that they were going to need to continue the line. It was very crucial to protect those. And the 320th got a unit citation from Eisenhower for doing their job very, very well.
Yeah, I mean,
And
you know, kind of confirm. I didn't. Yeah, I knew they had brought down a certain number of aircraft, but it's like I don't know. It's like lifeboats, life belts on a harbor, on a quayside in a harbor. The fact they may only get used every now and then, but the fact they're there all the time is the key thing there. And they did bring down enemy aircraft, but the main thing is this deterrent. It's that making that beachhead an unattractive place for a Luftwaffe
yes.
force to go, and that's what they did to their credit. So we've got some great questions coming in from around the world about, you know, you talked about the Jim Crow laws and what have you in the USA, and as you said, that's a big part of the first part of your book. But Michael Nelson over in Fremantle is saying, how were the black soldiers treated by the locals? So when they got to Normandy, I mean, we've talked to perhaps not yourself and me, but we've talked generally about the welcome that the African American troops got in the UK and England, and there were riots between white and American black servicemen, but the locals generally just didn't. They appreciated the African Americans, but France was a bit different. You know, it was I know that the 688 got a great reaction, and when they were back in Rouen there. So, in your investigations of the men of the 320th, what did they remark about France as opposed to Britain and UK?
They also got a great reception. The thing to remember is, in Normandy, people were very, very leery at first of all of the Allied soldiers.
Yeah.
They remembered Dunkirk. They remembered what would happen if that Allied, invasion, liberation wasn't successful, right? And they were very leery. They were leery of these Allied soldiers coming in, and also it wasn't like in the towns and in the cities in the UK, where even though there were terrible bombardments, there was also much joy still in these towns, with these soldiers being welcomed into homes. You know, in Oxfordshire, in Wales, this battalion, they were treated like stars, you know, and invited to tea, invited to dinner, became, one of the men in the book I write about, Wilson Monk, became like a second son to the Welsh family that adopted him. And this was astounding to these soldiers. They spent months training in the UK. France, in Normandy, was devastated, as you know, by war. So you had people who, a lot of the troops were helping by sharing some of their, provisions and things like this. The men have lovely stories of being given Calvados and making friends. Did any of them, was it as elaborate as the UK? No, they also had a job to do. 24/7 they were on, and a lot of these men didn't have any time, basically, to be having tea and dinner with the locals, and so they were working. They were on the beach.
A little bit busy. Yeah.
They were busy.
We had a comment. Sorry to interrupt. We have two comments from Darren, and Darren lives in Newport in Wales, and he was saying the 320th were just based near his home, yes. And he also said that that they would frequent Newport, where he's from, and Monk, who you mentioned there, was stationed in the basement of Pontypool Methodist Church, which is just down the road from him, and he's agreeing with you. The welcome that the Welsh gave them was just as they would anybody, just.
Right.
Their soldiers come here to fight for the cause, and so let's just give them the welcome, and that's fantastic.
This is a picture of one of the batteries, the headquarters battery in Cherbourg, Octeville, in July '44. And we have pictures from Normandy that from one of the men who saved all these pictures, wrote on them, George Davison, top left. He was a clerk in this battalion. And thanks to George, we have, there aren't pictures from the UK because photochemicals were so hard to, and film were so hard to obtain, but somehow they had them in France. And so we have all these pictures from France. And so it's quite joyous. In my slide presentation, I have a picture of Trinity Methodist in Abersoch in Wales. These men were billeted all around Pontypool near Newport. And the people of that whole area helped me so much, and we did some nice presentations there, and so I'm happy they have such good memories. So,
and you know, the similar thing happened with the people of Birmingham in England with the 688, you know, and the links and the locals are very interested, which kind of brings me to kind of what I wanted to talk to you about is, well, firstly, let's talk about what, you know, you said that how joyous it was that Woodson finally received the Distinguished Service Cross, which is not bad. It's one day of the Medal of Honor, but that is an absolute complete recognition of what he did that day.
Number two, very important.
Yeah, it's number two. It's you know, it's not shabby. But so what this is sort of a trite interviewer's question really, but I feel compelled to say it, which is, but what obviously it means a lot for the Woodson family. It means that he is being individually recognized for his bravery. But what does it mean on a wider sort of social platform? You know, we are in this interesting area where diversity, sometimes it's considered a bad word by some people. Other people think it's a progressive thing. But what does it mean to you as the author of this book?
It means that finally, you know, as Barack Obama said in 2015, when he presented a posthumous Medal of Honor for a World War I African-American sergeant, you know, it's never too late to say thank you. And it's acknowledging that that these men, many men, were not given the medals that they deserve. And these are all documented. This isn't like somebody just decided decades later that we needed some more medals. There is a paper trail here from 1944 that shows that generals and thought that Waverly Woodson should, at least two that I know of, thought that Waverly Woodson very much deserved the Medal of Honor, not the Distinguished Service Cross, but the Medal of Honor. And we're still hoping that he'll get the Medal of Honor. Will he get this Medal of Honor today under this administration? No, no, I'm sure he wouldn't. But, you know, our work isn't finished, and we're very patient. We're very patient. So,
and this is the thing about it's highlighting what he achieved in World War II. And as you say there, you know, it's not like you said, they're not like plucking this out of the air. He was genuinely put forward for this. He was recognized for his bravery very early on. And then at some point it reached that impasse that we know why the impasse. I mean, I remember, I'm going off on a rabbit hole, when I got copies of, I think it was all the British 3rd Division gallantry recommendations, most of which had passed either Miles Dempsey, commander of 2nd Division's, 2nd Army's desk, or Montgomery's desk. And it was all sorts of people from different regiments, officers, other ranks, sergeants, blah, blah, blah. But so often they seem to have a little penciled in comment by Montgomery about, I'm not sure what school this chap went to, and do we know what his parents did, and things like that. And so that's class. That's absolutely class rearing its head there. And it's a different thing to race, but it's still a recognition of how the system worked back then, or how it didn't work fairly, is a better way of explaining it. So this campaign you've been part of is part of the generally trying to admit that the system was loaded in a certain area. I mean, try careful with my words here. And it's important for us to realize the system had these imperfections back then.
Well, no black soldiers, 10% of the Army received high honors. And that's interesting because it's statistically impossible. I mean, frankly, even if you're in a labor and service battalion, that you wouldn't be showing bravery. And what we've learned, you mentioned the 6 888s and their story. You can see that on Netflix. Oh, also you can see the story of my book and these men, episode 2 on Disney Plus of the docuseries Erased, which includes first episode, Pearl Harbor. First hero was a black cook laundryman. That was the level of jumped behind a gun. Doris Miller took out some Japanese planes, dragged the commander of the ship, who was mortally wounded, who got the Medal of Honor, to safety. He received the Navy Cross, which was number 3, but much later, the Navy didn't even want to reveal his name. It was the black press demanding it, that we even know about Doris Miller. at that time. And so that's episode 1. Episode 2 is D-Day. So it's this story. And then there's 2 more episodes, one on the Black Panthers, the tank unit, the American tank unit, but also the unit of colonial Indian soldiers who served with the British. So why are we doing this now? We're doing this now because these are stories that people didn't know about. And should they know about them? Does it bring one group of veterans up into, and one group of soldiers up into the limelight that undeservedly? I don't think it's undeservedly. I think
exactly.
What we've learned is we have to rediscover our own history. And that's what we're seeing here.
The interesting thing is that what's that expression that cream always rises to the top, is that you would have thought that these stories should have naturally, just over the years, we've developed since World War II. We're better than we are. We're not perfect, but we have moved on, and segregation is not a thing anymore. And, there's, well, not as much, and you know what I mean, folks. We've moved. You would have thought that these stories would just have kind of come out, but they've all seemed to have someone absolutely fight tooth and nail. I'm thinking about Dame Joanna Lumley in the UK trying to get the Gurkhas their recognition. I'm thinking about the people doing the same for other, Indian, British, and the work you and your friends have been doing for Waverly Woods. It seems people have to just fiercely fight and against a brick wall to get these stories to surface. And then when they finally do, everyone goes, well, why didn't we know about this before? It's frustrating, isn't it? That it seems to have to take so much recognition, or you have to get some kind of, like it was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote the first book about the Black Panthers, I think, wasn't it? So it needs that kind of celebrity status. So where the bottom line is, where do you think we are in 2025, June the 6th, today, Linda? Where are we in being fair about history?
Well, it's very difficult for me to see the retrenchment that we've seen over the last year in terms of celebrating the stories of people who were forgotten. Of course, it's hard for me to see that. And I'm just looking for a slide here.
Pick up again. Yep.
I wanted to show you this. So this is a press release from 1944. Extraordinary, the Army would cite one soldier for heroism in a press release who was not a white soldier. You can't tell me that we have evidence like this. We have a paper trail like this. And it's somehow woke, or it's somehow political correctness to honor our soldiers who were erased, who were forgotten. All of these words, of all of these titles, they mean something. Being erased from history is terrible. It's terrible. Who's it terrible for? It's terrible for all of us. It's not just terrible for African Americans or Black British. It's terrible for us, the rest of the population, when our history is edited for us, that people are edited out. This is just wrong. We all as a society lose from that, and that's I think this message, right? So
and what's so frustrating is that some of the same people who would be the kind of ones who'd roll their eyes at something like Woodson's medal being upgraded are the same kind of people that say, but people don't know about World War II anymore. Young people don't know anything about our past, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you want young people to learn about the past, that means all young people. That means all of our communities. So, you go to a UK school, like you go to a French school where you are in Paris, or you'll have people from across the world, ancestrally. And if you want to make them understand the past, you've got to make it accessible to them through their lens. So if you've got people from what was then colonial French North Africa, you talk about the colonial French North African troops and what they participated. If you've got people from other parts of the world, the Spanish, French, the whatever, and that way it becomes a shared history for everybody, as opposed to, oh, that's not my history, that's not. So I don't understand the rationale of the people who are against this movement of recognition for minorities, because they're the same people, as I say, who want World War II to still be talked about. So I'm like, what are they arguing against? Their argument doesn't even make sense.
Yeah. And I think it's just a broad brush. We're going to eliminate, we've read about how the honored Black veterans and other units are just being taken out of records in the U.S. online by the government. And I don't know if that has been rectified now that it's been publicized, or if they're just going to continue to say, well, that's DEI, and we're going to take that out, diversity, education, inclusion, which is now a no-go for the U.S. government. I hope that some sense has come in. I have not searched myself. It was all too distressing at the time to see this, but I've been told by lots of people that this has been happening. I can't imagine that cooler heads won't prevail and that those names will be restored. I have faith. I have faith in humans that we will acknowledge. I mean, look, we're looking at Waverly Woodson at Arlington National Cemetery. His grave, his widow, Joanne, just had a birthday a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, hopefully, your sensible heads will prevail and the stories will come out there. But it's not just about the certain aspects of history being removed that don't fit into the current administration's vision. It's the fact that just archives are being harder to accessible. People are losing funding, archives are disappearing, websites that had resources are being closed down, and as you say, hopefully they'll be restored there. But it's a worrying trend that there's going to be less documentation available. We were doing so well. So many things were coming online, digital archives. It was getting accessible, and it seems we've just taken a bit of a backward step recently, which is hopefully it's a temporary one.
It's all still there, just waiting
to be reinstated.
Right? I mean, it's all still there, and thanks to the efforts of a lot of people, the U.S. Army has been fantastic in terms of acknowledging its heroes. The First Army, which is based in Illinois, has renamed a clinic after Waverly Woodson. It was their historian who was really helping in this campaign to convince the Army to give a medal. The Army in general does not want to set precedents, and they want to, of course, keep a super high bar for the Medal of Honor. But when we look at the medals of honor, awarded for battles, we have very few from the Normandy invasion. And I think, especially when we hear that there had been a recommendation for a Medal of Honor, I think we're right to look at that. And we're absolutely correct to look at it closely and to see if that soldier really rated. But the fact that any soldier could rise to that level to be considered is extraordinary. But we also saw that press release from the Army itself praising that soldier. Yeah,
and that's I remember that the buzz a few years ago about people say, oh well, they're just trying to pluck names out to for it's tokenism. It's just they want to get no, you've made it absolutely clear today and in the book that these people were written about. Back then, it was acknowledged that what they did was extraordinary. There's no attempt to just find a name and make someone a token, sort of not a random representation of his race.
They had to work harder to be acknowledged. That's the thing, and that's very clear. That's very, very clear from all the facts. You were talking earlier about the relegation of Black soldiers to labor and service battalions. Well, what we saw in the months after D-Day in 1944 at the Battle of the Bulge, the U.S. forces lost so many men from June through the Battle of the Bulge that when they put out a call for volunteers, riflemen, you had many, many, many Black soldiers who knew how to use guns. I mean, remember, most of the Black men recruited were Southern men who knew how to hunt and who knew how to use guns. And they signed up. Many of them who were non-commissioned officers who had higher positions took lower positions to fight alongside white men. So their platoons might have been segregated, but they were shoulder to shoulder with white men. And that was the first time that Black and white soldiers had fought that way since the Revolutionary War. And what everyone has said, any general, any commander who was quoted from that time, is that those soldiers, those volunteer riflemen, were extraordinarily brave and were extraordinarily, vicious and ferocious, because part of the mythology around the Black soldier created by the U.S. Army during World War II was that these men were not intelligent. They had smaller brains. They were not as courageous. They were superstitious. They were fearful. They could not lead. And this is in the Army documentation. And you have to have it in the Army documentation if you want to dehumanize a population. And that's exactly what they did. Yeah. So
I mean, we had Steve Clay on recently, who's a First Division veteran of the more recent times, and Colonel Fontenot has been on. And in the presentation about the First Division, the Harz Mountains and the Rhine and Ruhr, he did that very story. You talk about the African American units coming in, and he said it was the smoothest transition the 16th Infantry pretty much had, because there was no having to bring these guys up to speed. There was no, here's the rifle, the point, that's the at the end. These guys came in, they were expert marksmen, they were dedicated, they were physically fit, they went straight into action and redeemed themselves within minutes of that first action. And Steve made the point, yet it still took 4 years after that for desegregation to occur in the US. They've now got absolute evidence staring them at the face. They've got the after action reports of all these different notable actions of here's where African American troops excelled and did this. They stopped the Germans, they halted this, and yet it still took another few years. But I guess at least progress was made.
Yeah, and the only reason that President Truman desegregated the Army, ordered the desegregation of the armed forces, was because of a soldier who was viciously attacked coming home in 1946. Coming home in uniform. He was attacked on a bus. He was blinded. After he asked if there could be a bathroom stop, the next stop, the bus driver had the local sheriff and others take him off the bus, and he was beaten so severely. So pictures of him all bandaged, that was really what prompted the White House to finally take action. And then it would be a couple more years till really in practice, the Army was desegregated. And what's interesting is the Army was really the only welcoming place, in quotes, for a Black soldier when the war began, when the U.S. became involved in World War II. The Navy, you could not have anything higher than, messman, which is what Dory Miller's rank was, cook, laundry and things like this. And then at the end, the Navy and even the Marines had outpaced the Army in terms of integration. So.
Yeah, and I'll just read out a couple of comments there. So again, Colonel Fontenot, who's being active in the sidebar, thanks for that. He's talking about the Medal of Honor being difficult to receive, but difficult to qualify for. And he's saying the point is it is hard to get. And yes, Black soldiers did have a harder road to get there. We are correcting the record and we'll continue to do so. So, there are plenty of people like you, Linda, like Gregory there, who are on the right road and acknowledging this. And this is a very moving message I saw there from Mel Pell there. So little has been written about the contributions made by African American GIs on D-Day in Normandy. This is very personal to me because my late father was an African American GI in England back then. So thanks for that comment, Mel Pell. We're people like Linda are pushing this story forward. But yeah, I feel like it's widely known to the people who want to know these kind of history, but there are still people a little bit with their kind of, heads in the sand like ostriches, sort of ignoring the fact that there are people like Waverly Woodson. It's those people we have to reach, or just bypass them and get onto the kids and make sure they are aware. That's maybe the other way. Sometimes you can't convert some people. You have to accept that they are who they are. But again, as I started off with this, Linda, 10 years since you've written the book, and we talked about Woodson and the progress and sometimes lack of progress. But again, what do you think is the future? Are we going to be able to sing a better future where we talk about World War II without that, color difference? And it will be. Do you think it'll be better?
Well, in terms of the conversation about World War II can't take place without a color conversation.
Yeah.
What's important is to explain how bad this was. I mean, remember when I heard about this story in 2009, that was when William Dabney was getting veteran from Virginia, was honored in France for the 65th anniversary of D-Day. And he got the Legion of Honor, France's highest medal. Here in Paris, when he got that medal, and we all wrote about him, and we wrote about this battalion. A lot of us, the American reporters, we didn't know that, or if we learned, we didn't remember that the Army had been segregated in World War II. And so for us, this was a real learning experience, the reporters. And I remember saying, like, what? And like, what are barrage balloons? Didn't know anything. The story was so fascinating. That's why I kept looking into it, because it was just so interesting to me. It seemed a shame to just write one newspaper story about Bill Dabney. And he was also such an amazing guy, amazing guy that I'm just going to put a picture up of him. Here's Bill wearing his French Legion of Honor in his backyard in Roanoke, Virginia. Wonderful man, passed away a few years ago. He's represented. There's an actor who depicts Waverly Woodson and Bill Dabney, and Henry Parham from my book in that Erased series. And it's very important that the next generation understands the role of segregation, and understands that this sort of backlash that we're seeing now to inclusion, this backlash that we're seeing toward our own history is political. You had mentioned earlier, how much should we talk about politics when we speak about history? Well, they're really intertwined, right?
Absolutely.
Because at the time they were intertwined, and they're still intertwined now. How we depict our history, how we edit it, how we take people out of it, how we put people in it. And one of the defining features of the African American soldier, and Black British soldiers also, is that we have to rediscover our history. Same thing with Tuskegee Airmen, the Black pilots in World War II. We only know about them because of a TV. We, the public, not specialists, know about them because of a TV movie in 1995. And so I always ask when I talk about this book, why must we always rediscover our own history? But that's how it's going to be. We have to keep presenting our history in all its, including everyone who was excluded. And that's going to be how we continue to teach this. It will never be a colorblind history, because it wasn't colorblind, so.
No, I mean, and this is the very subject we talk about so often on this channel, is that the way people visualize the war who didn't live through the war. I mean, Britain, we have the problem of the 1940 Britain stood alone myth and things like that. And that is that if we're selective about how we remember the war, we're not understanding the war. The fact is that the world was a darker place in many ways, and there was classism, there was racism. And then John McManus, who's one of my greatest friends in history and writes brilliantly, he's adamant as an American professor of history that you cannot take race out of the World War II story from the American point of view. You just can't. If you don't bring race into it, you're missing a key part of it. As you said, that if you don't mention the politics, if you don't mention this, you can't. it all just becomes talking about which is the coolest fighter aircraft and which is your favorite machine gun. And I hate it when someone says to me, which is your favorite machine gun? I don't like any of them. They're there to kill people. But in terms of which is the one that did its job the best way, I will give you an answer. But I don't think it's actually right to have a favorite machine gun. But yeah, I'm digressing a bit. But this point is that we have to acknowledge that there are these more serious, troubling areas of World War II, but if we keep talking about them, we learn from them, and that's the ultimate thing.
Oh, it's true. It's true. And it's thanks to programs like yours and you know, people who just communicate the story of this war. World War II is always going to be mythic. It's always going to be with us. It just is, you know, it's just such a story, you know. It is just such a story of heroism and triumph and a very clear enemy. And, you know, but it's when we get into the nuances of it. A lot of people, when this book came out, said to me that they didn't know, for instance, how badly behaved the white soldiers were in Britain, and how a lot of the British public were turning against the white soldiers. On the one hand, we want the US Army with us, but on the other hand, life in some of these towns and villages with these marauding American white soldiers was terrible. And the black soldiers were not part of that. And I can generalize that because I've looked into this. Not one bad word. George Orwell wrote about the white soldiers being badly behaved. And, you know, even a historian said to me, "Are you sure about that?" And I said, "I know, you know, I know the unit numbers of them. Yes, like in some towns, you know, and it's a bit of a mythic tale now that in some pubs it was, you know, self-segregation. They chose the black soldiers when the white soldiers didn't. American GIs didn't want to socialize with them. They chose the black soldiers. That didn't happen quite probably as wide as the mythology says it did, but it definitely did. And certainly in some of these towns in Wales, some of the children remember very clearly that. So.
Well, as we said, there's these lasting legacies, which is fantastic. But we will bring things to end there. So, folks, as always, the link to Linda's book is in the description below. There's so that's the UK cover. There's in the description below. If you haven't got it yet, it's a great read. As you said there, Linda, it culminates on D-Day, but it tells a very important story on the way there. I'm back into a couple of hours with Charles Herrick talking about Robert Capa's photos on D-Day, busts some myths there, which is always the job of what we do on this channel. But in the meantime, click like and subscribe, buy my guests' books, read their blogs, so they do give us more history. So thank you, Linda, for joining us. Thank you, viewers, for your comments. And I'll see you all again later. Cheers, everybody. Bye.